This lecture introduces the culture that would take over the Byzantine Empire, slowly spreading throughout North Africa, the Middle East, all the way to Eastern Europe. That is Islam. This class will cover Islamic art from the 7th until the 15th century. And to put this religion in perspective, we should note that Muslims account for 1.6 billion of the world's population, hence they're nearly a quarter of the entire world, the second largest religion after Christianity. There are 2.2 billion Christians in the world, nearly half of them in Africa. Islam, as a religion and as a geopolitical entity, did not exist until the 7th century, arising from the Arabian deserts in the 600s. Here there are no great cities, and the deserts are sparsely inhabited by tribal nomads living in small familial groups. These familial groups will come to define Islam to this day, and the tribal associations and, of course, the arrangements they have between them. This new religion would spread rapidly throughout North Africa, Southern and Eastern Europe, and even Asia. It would absorb and combine these various traditions it comes in contact with, from the Christian West to the African desert peoples, to once again the Middle Eastern cultures, all the way to modern-day India. Hence the Islamic world is very eclectic and connects these various civilizations by way of trade across these two continents. Now, Islam is going to rise in Medina and Mecca in Arabia to the south here. It was here that the Prophet Muhammad, in the desert outside of Mecca, received God's message to found a new religion in 610. He heard this message from the mouthpiece of God, Gabriel, the archangel who delivers messages. As in the Christian tradition, Gabriel would deliver the message to the Virgin Mary that she would give birth to Christ. He is going to found here, that is Muhammad, Islam, which is going to be the religion, literally from the Arabic, submission to God's will. Muslims are going to be those who have submitted to God's will. The Meccans, however, were not appreciative of Muhammad's original message, and they expelled him to Medina in 622. 8 years later, Muhammad would return to Mecca with an army of 10,000 of his own soldiers to oust those who would not listen to the message of God. The calendar in the Muslim world then begins in 622 with this immigration of Muhammad from Mecca to Medina, known as the Hijrah. Therefore, the term that is identifying what year it is in the Islamic calendar is AH, after the Hijrah, instead of AD for Anno Domini, the year of our Lord in the Christian tradition. We find that Muhammad takes the faithful with him at this time out of Mecca to Medina, where he sets up his home, which becomes the model for the first mosque. Upon returning and establishing Mecca as the spiritual capital of Islam, which it still is to this very day, we note that the first thing he did was to head to the heart of the city, to the Kaaba. The Kaaba, according to Islamic tradition, is a cubical textile-draped shrine that Ibrahim and Ishmael built for God, and was the focus of pilgrimage and polytheistic worship all the way through late antiquity up until the 7th century. Therefore, it was already a religious center of pilgrimage, and remains so to this day. We find that today it is the destination of the annual Hajj, the obligatory pilgrimage in the Islamic calendar, where all able-bodied Muslims must make their way to Mecca and circumambulate the Kaaba, thus walking around praying to the Kaaba. We should note, however, that the Kaaba today does not have any religious imagery on it. We have a black draped shrine here, which has Kufic script or Arabic script around it, written from right to left. Muhammad, tradition tells us, removes all pagan idols when first arriving here at Mecca to establish his new religion. And he also is going to establish an iconism, or the avoidance of figural imagery in Islamic worship. We do not see images of figures relating to those from the Quran. We do not have illustrations of either Muhammad or Allah. Instead, we are going to develop a very complex vocabulary of non-figural ornament, geometric designs, arabesques, these whiplash patterns especially, and that will revel in surface decoration instead of attempting to move us beyond the surface as in the Western notion of a picture window. Now, with Islam, we find that Muslims do not consider Christ the true voice of God, though they do admit that he is a prophet, just like those in the Christian tradition that came before Christ, like Moses, Ezekiel, and others. Muhammad in the Islamic faith is the true voice of God. We find that in Islam, the notion of the Trinity is also disregarded, for the notion of having a tripartite Godhead of Father, Son, and Holy Ghost is seen as pagan and polytheistic, remnants of the old pagan religion out of which Christianity grew in ancient Rome. Allah, on the other hand, is a singular entity. He is not divisible in these smaller units or understood in these tripartite divisions. The Quran, literally in Arabic the recitation, is going to be finalized in the Third Caliphate and is written in Arabic, the universal language among scholars in the Islamic world, and will have the voice of God that was passed down from Muhammad to, once again, these scribes. Carrying on the tradition of Muhammad, we find that initially caliphs are going to succeed him, and they rule until the assassination of Ali in 661, at which point Islam will be divided between two different factions. The Shiites are going to be followers of the Caliph who believe that only the descendants of Ali should rule and should communicate the intentions of God. They believe in the rightful succession from Muhammad, but represent only 10% of Muslims worldwide. Vast majority of Muslims will be known as Sunni Muslims. They follow the Prophet but disregard the rightful succession or heir to the throne. This is much like Catholics and Protestants in the Western world, where Catholics are going to follow Christ's successor here on earth, or St. Peter in the papacy, whereas Protestants follow Christ's message. There are 2.2 billion Christians in the world, and they make up roughly 50-50 of Catholics and Protestants. They are not nearly as unequally divided as the Muslim world. One of the first holy cities that Islam spreads to is Jerusalem, where they will then erect many monuments to this new religion that dominate the skyline to this day. One of those monuments, and the first one to be created in the third most holy site in all of Islam, is going to represent the conquest of Jerusalem in 638, and that's going to be the Dome of the Rock. The site of the Dome of the Rock was already a holy site for both Jews and Christians, for it was believed to be the site of the first and second Jewish temples. It was also associated with King Solomon, and they believed maybe the Temple of Solomon was here. The site of creation, that being where Adam was created, is also believed to be on this spot, and it is supposedly where Abraham was to sacrifice Isaac. For Muslims, it would be the rock where Muhammad ascended to God on his night journey, a very holy spot for all three religions. And as Islam builds on the site last, it states that it supplants the first two religions as the final revelation of God's will. The structure itself is centrally planned with a dome on top like Byzantine churches before it, but it does not have a plain exterior, being very richly and ornately decorated with Kufic script and blue tiles around with geometric shapes and patterns. The dome on a circular drum pierced with windows on the inside again is reminiscent of Byzantine models, and certainly all of the civilizations that the Muslims conquer are going to be absorbed into a new Islamic vocabulary, and the Byzantines are certainly one of them. The dome supported by arcades of alternating piers and columns creates concentric aisles or ambulatories which are designed to allow someone to walk around the interior space. Just like that of the Kaaba in Mecca, we circumambulate and then kneel and pray here to this very holy site and relic. This allows visitors to circumambulate as with the other great holy Islamic sites. Here is an image of the rock itself with a small parapet surrounding it, protecting it. But we would note that there are these rugs all the way around the interior space, thus it is designed to kneel in front of. Here again we see actual visitors who are practicing the prayer that is going to go along with the circumambulation, the walking around. Thus they can venerate and consider the night journey of Muhammad. Without, we should note, representational imagery. Instead we have mosaics and vegetal motifs with vinework, scrolls, and other images that are actually carried on from the Christian tradition. An example of a house of worship in Islam can be found in an early mosque at Tunisia. Here we find that mosques are going to, literally from the Arabic word place of prostration, be worshiping centers that you are to kneel towards Mecca. They are a square enclosure framed by a large courtyard, and they're all based on Muhammad's own home in Medina that he sets up. Mosques need to have a minaret or a tower to call the faithful to prayer on one side. Thus we find these become easily identifiable architectural features in the Islamic world. The flat hypostyle prayer hall will always be oriented towards Mecca, and again because these are largely built in desert areas, there's low precipitation, so the roofs are primarily flat. They don't have to be angled to allow water or snow to be filtered off. Here is the open courtyard at the particular mosque here that must be included in the design and will be through till today. The interior is a hypostyle hall or a multi-columned mosque where we find that the roof is held up with forests of columns. This is the most common early type of mosque that we have from the 7th until the 9th century. It is all centered on, importantly, a wall with a niche. This is known as, and you direct your attention towards, the Qibla wall. This faces towards Mecca and acts much as a compass or needlepoint, showing us which direction we need to face to ensure our prayers are heard. The mihrab niche centered on it certainly could be understood as the needlepoint because it is a focal point taken from other traditions, other religions. The mihrab niche, signifying a holy place, would have earlier been used by Jews in synagogues to place the Torah scrolls or the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. For ancient Greco-Roman temples, we find that these niches would be the frame for sculptures of particular gods, like in the Pantheon, the 7 planetary gods occupy these niches. In churches, as in the Byzantine examples we just looked at, the apse is going to be located where the high altar is, and will have mosaics in it often representing heaven or paradise. So there is already a built-in significance for these focal points in these religious structures. Now otherwise, we find mosques lack an architectural focus such as an altar. We do not have a clergy in the Islamic faith, and so we find all faithful pray equally towards God. However, discussions of passages in the Quran could be led by an imam or an elder in a given town without the intermediary of a priesthood. So we need a structure that would allow us to see this person elevated above everyone else. Here we have an example of one of these minbars. Now a minbar in the Islamic faith is a raised pulpit where weekly sermons could be delivered, but is not intended to be understood as the same type of authority granted to the clergy in the Catholic Church. These are merely going to be sermons or readings directly from the Quran with discussions. Now this is closer to the sermon pulpit that we would have built in Catholic churches, generally in the middle of a nave, not to be used for Mass at the front of the nave. The eclectic borrowings that we find in Islamic architecture are going to draw from a variety of sources, including Byzantine, Roman, Visigothic, and Arian Christians throughout Europe. They are going to adopt these shapes, but because they are spread primarily in Islamic structures like mosques, they become associated more closely with their Islamic builders instead of their Christian builders. One of those designs is a horseshoe-shaped arch that's going to form a circle, a concentric circle at the top, pinching inward and then tapering back outward. This is very common in early mosque design and thus is associated with Islamic architecture. Turning to Cordoba in southern Spain, we have the Umayyad Caliphate established here and a type of Hispano-Umayyad architecture built. It would be Abd al-Rahman I, the ruler of the Umayyad dynasty, who settles here in Cordoba after the rest of his family are brutally murdered by the Abbasid caliphs. He is a great patron of the arts, and we find that the mosque here at Cordoba is an excellent example of the eclectic appropriation and the integration of different religions into the structure. Here, in the Great Mosque at Cordoba, we have a mosque built over a Visigothic Christian church, which was then expanded 3 times. Here you can see the expansion of this church and the roofs because we have greater precipitation here. We include a minaret and then a courtyard, as is the case with all mosques. However, it was recaptured by Christians and converted back into a Christian church. A very interesting, eclectic mix of these cultures in southern Spain. The original mosque would have been expanded several times until it encloses 620 by 460 feet. Now, mosques in the Islamic world were, by definition, modular and could be expanded as a congregation grew. We merely extend the axes. We do not have quite the restrictions as in the Christian or the Byzantine liturgy. So the original mosque of 786 can be seen here highlighted. When the congregation outgrew it, it expands northward and then southward, and then finally doubles in size by 987 AD. The exterior decoration is very telling of what you find on the inside, because spolia is going to be used from earlier Visigothic Christian churches. They are taken and then placed on the surface, much as we find the spolia from the sack of Constantinople is placed on the front of San Marco in Venice. Now, the dominant motif found here from Visigothic precedents is the double flying arches that introduce us to the decoration we will see on the interior. These overlapping horseshoe-shaped arches seem to be distinctly Islamic, but are in fact carried on from the existing tradition. Here on the interior, in the massive hypostyle hall, or columnar hall that holds up the ceiling, this flat roof, we have double flying arches, which are horseshoe-shaped by design. This was favored by the Visigothic Christians who lived here before the Umayyad Caliph took over. They also adopt the red and white brick from earlier Romans, even before them. These red and white alternating bricks could withstand earthquakes and were shock absorbent in many ways. So therefore they were added and appended to the Islamic mosque as well. Just like the hypostyle hall we looked at here at Kairouan in Tunisia, we can see that the columns very often obstruct our view of the interior space. But it need not concern us as long as we know where the mihrab niche is and where to direct our attention. There is an additional component to the Great Mosque at Cordoba that we do not find earlier in the maksura, or an enclosure in front of the mihrab niche. Now this is going to be common in areas built for and mosques that are built for caliphs or these rulers, for they are reserved for the aristocracy and are built primarily to protect these rulers while they are praying and their backs are turned to the congregation. The function of the maxura is much like an iconostasis or a templon in the Byzantine tradition, for it separates us from the holiest of holies beyond. If we move past the maxura and look up, we would see a melon-shaped ribbed dome over the central bay. This celestial canopy is going to float upon a web of crisscrossing arches that seem to be very geometrically complex, but are still based on the same fundamental designs in Byzantine, Middle Byzantine cross and square churches. For the design and the mosaics are actually installed by a Christian Byzantine master who was sent by the emperor in Constantinople. The design, thus, is going to be a circle in a square, just like the Catholicon at Hosios Lukas we looked at, and or the Church of the Dormition at Daphne. The decoration may also seem to be somewhat exotic and Islamic, but is still anchored in the Christian tradition. For in this melon-shaped dome we find vinework and scrolls that would have been in early Christian churches relating to the Eucharist and or the wine that would become through transubstantiation the blood of Christ. Here we find that Kufic script actually describes paradise and Allah and where we will go in paradise, surrounded by arabesque patterns, vegetal motifs, and vine scrolls that are carried out and decorated by Christian mosaicists. Here, unlike the Byzantine and Christian illustration of God who looks down on us, it is not that radically different for Islam, for instead of showing a picture of God, they merely write the name of God around it. So therefore we have the same message that is shown: God in paradise, the promise of our soul's ascension to heaven. The love of complexity and patterning seen here is just going to increase as the mathematical and the geometric interest will lead to further developments in Islamic architecture. Because they are not investigating representational art, this must come out in decorations and adornment elsewhere. Now, libraries are associated with madrasas, these colleges, which are endowed by the elite, not paid for by way of taxes, but the wealthy in these Islamic communities are expected to put forth money, much like tithing in the Jewish or Christian tradition. This is going to place emphasis in these madrasas on study of the Quran, which promoted a high degree of literacy in men and women, whereby we find that hand-copied books, which are very costly, would be donated or paid for by the elite in a community. They are very expensive because the Islamic world does not adopt the printing press until the 19th century. This is going to mean that calligraphy is a highly respected and valuable art form. The art of hand lettering is going to require no figural imagery or representational training. Instead, the principal vehicle for visual communication is the written word in Kufic script here. But it can also be understood as pure aesthetic pleasure, understanding the rhythmic purity and the elegance that's going to define Kufic script. This is going to be produced on vellum, another very expensive material, which is going to be cured hide, generally calf skin. Calligraphers, importantly, are the highest status of all artists or artisans, and included even princes and women. It took a lifetime to master the techniques here with long, arduous training, but would receive public recognition once you had achieved the status of master. Arabic in these Kufic scripts, most of them of Qurans, are going to be read from right to left, the opposite of that of English or Latin. We find that Kufic, the official script of the Islamic world that is adopted officially in the 9th century, is going to be made up of blocky, angular Arabic script forms, with long, drawn-out horizontal stripes or swipes with vertical elements as well. The dots that you see here of red are going to highlight a pronunciation guide for those that are reading this. The Kufic script you saw a moment ago on monuments such as the Sultan Hassan Madrasa Mosque complex, whereby you have long bars that lift up vertically and drag horizontally. Kufic script, in fact, became the most common style for Arabic between the 8th and 9th century, the variety of which exploded with more than 20 different styles by the 10th century. These would be standardized by Ibn Muqla, who was an Abbasid official who fixed the proportions of the letters, developed the method of teaching calligraphy that is still used today. The wide availability of paper would around the year 1000 replace vellum, thus we have abundance of cheap books, but still the requirement for them to be hand copied. Now, Kufic is not only used in illuminated manuscripts and on paper, it also decorated a number of objects, such as buildings and plates and other objects that would have been used in everyday life. Here we have a plate with Kufic border script here from the 10th to the 12th century. This is on white pottery, taking an important verse from the Quran and spreading it out through a spoke-like pattern around the plate. This is an example of epigraphic ware, which is going to have a clear lead glaze over a painted black inscription. The script is elongated enough to fill the rim, stressing verticality. The model would have been provided by a calligrapher for the potter and painter here. The verse is actually taken from the Quran, which states, "Knowledge, the beginning of it is bitter to taste, but the end is sweeter than honey," which would be rather appropriate for something you would be eating off of and for tableware. Lusterware is another example that would have also had elaborate Kufic script. Originally, they would have been used to decorate tiles of mihrab niches in 1862. Here we have examples of the lustrous effect that is going to be made possible through a particular type of glazing and firing. So lusterware has a metallic surface on ceramics and is produced by applying a paint laced with silver, copper, or gold oxides to the already fired vessel or tile. Thus, we fire it a second time at low heat to give it this iridescent effect. Oxides, fired the second time, burn away, leaving this reflective metallic sheen that resembles precious metal. Initially, we find that this would cover the entire surface, but it began to be used for specific designs. Here we have a lusterware jar of the 10th century, which is the most common variety with this monochrome lusterware in shades of brown. Here we have the design that reinforces the shape with the peacock's eye motif around the shoulder. The vertical stripes of the frame are going to frame, as it were, the human figure in the center who is bent over. Comparing it to Greek vase painting, we have an emphasis on the surface. Thus, of course, anytime there is negative space, these elaborate designs are going to be added to draw one's eye to the surface, not allowing us to move back into the painting or beyond the surface of this painting into the pot itself, and focus instead on the figural design. We find that the type that is seen here is a dark hooded garment with a bent posture holding a strand of beads looking out at the viewer. Therefore, Islamic art can be understood as an eclectic adoption of the architectural and decorative forms of the cultures they come in contact with and conquer. The love of geometric and decorative complexity can be seen in the calligraphic motifs and the avoidance of figural imagery. Next time, we will continue with the later period in Islamic art leading up to the challenge that Islamic architects have trying to overcome the Hagia Sophia and similar Christian architecture.